So, about 2 weeks ago, it was a Monday evening, there was a big breaking news story that everyone was talking about. And the news was that the Supreme Court of the United States, it was leaked, is preparing to issue a decision, an unprecedented or precedent overturning decision that will change the map dramatically. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. So I assume most of you, or all of you, know what I'm talking about. And that's, of course, with regard to the question of the legality of abortion. So ever since 1973, there's a Supreme Court decision that applies across the entire United States that solidified this right, the right to perform an abortion, and prevents any laws from being passed against it. And now it looks like they're going to eliminate this right. And once that's the case, so many conservative-leaning states will rush, will hurry, or will automatically institute various limitations, some more, I don't want to use the word extreme, we're not taking sides here, so some going further than others, as all the news outlets and opinion outlets have been going on at length about ever since then. Why am I mentioning all of this? Because this is a topic that I don't want to speak about. And that was always my feeling about this topic, mainly because it's to me, it's a very well-known, well-trodden halachic discussion, and I don't usually like to talk about subjects when all the sources and all the ideas are all pretty well-known and there for the picking for anyone who's interested in looking it up. But just this past Shabbos, some asked me, is going to be a shiur on this topic. There are other shiurim already came out in the last 2 weeks. So, that's even more of a reason not to be interested. But then I thought to myself, maybe we can find some other aspect of this discussion that's been focused on less. So, here goes the following. Before I continue to the topic that I do want to discuss, I do feel that it's probably right to summarize the topic we're not discussing. So just in short, I hope you know generally, we know that abortion is prohibited for Jews, but it's seemingly not treated as tantamount to murder. Whereas benayach, non-Jews, the halacha is nerag, are put to death for killing a fetus, which is an interesting twist. Of course, all of this, for both, is we're referring to after 40 days elapse from the moment of conception, which today would be the equivalent, more or less, to when the heartbeat begins, the heartbeat is detected, etc., etc. On the other hand, we know generally that according to halacha, we will perform an abortion, we will kill the fetus if it seems to pose a threat to the mother. Now in the last few hundred years, and particularly in the last 100 years, so now you have all the contemporary modern day questions. What do you do in a case where the fetus is a mamzer, etc., or like in other words, rape, incest? What if there isn't a direct threat to the mother's health? Maybe there's a doubtful threat, potential threat. What if the fetus has some terrible disease? It's never going to make it, it's never going to survive into adulthood or even past a few years or a few days. What about those? So this discussion in recent Paiskim finds itself hinging on the fundamental question that everyone has, which is abortion murder? Does abortion equal murder or not? Another way of asking the question is a fetus a person or not? So, if you know the raid, so you should know, everyone knows, Igros Moshe says abortion is murder. He's very machmir. The Tzitz Eliezer essentially says abortion is not murder. He's mekel in some of these interesting cases. The question also loops around back to the Rambam, because when the Rambam explains why you can kill the uber, if there's a sakana, he says the uber is a reidef. That's interesting terminology that implies, seemingly, in most people's opinion, that the Rambam is attributing personhood and saying, but he's a reidef. There might also be a Teiras Chesed that gets quoted, where the Teiras Chesed might make a distinction between, even after 40 days, between once the baby is viable towards the end of the pregnancy versus before. So you have all of these concepts essentially in halacha as well. And if you're interested in hearing more, so you can listen to the podcasts that have been issued recently. I know Headlines had something about it. I know Rabbi Dinnerman here in Karnaitz gave a shiur about it. You can find it. I want to move on to also give a short overview of the legal, the moral, the political debate. I don't know if we have any sworn political operatives here in Kolel who have very strong opinions about politics, or who always follow the psak din of whoever gives the hashkafa on politics. If you have a very, very extremely strong opinion, maybe this isn't for you. But on the right, what we call the right, so the argument is simply, it's murder. And it's not just murder, it's mass murder. It's on the scale of millions, many millions. Usually goes along with the argument that there is personhood, it is a person. It often seems to be tied to certain religious ideas, which specifically ties into perhaps Christianity, how Christianity understands certain psukim. So for example, you have the pasuk v'yatzu yiladeh, and there might be a different interpretation there than ours. Doesn't have to always be based on religion, motivated by religion. It is possible to come just from a scientific angle. The heartbeat, just explaining what's going on at every stage. I think also because we're able to peek in and see so much of the process more than ever before, a lot of people emotionally attach themselves to an unborn child, which is a term that's used. And it's as if it's part of the family, it has a name to some. So that certainly is a factor as well. And you have those in this camp that go even further and they'll say life begins at conception. And maybe we should even pass laws that protect life from the moment of conception or even before conception. I don't know how often that's just a threat from the other side, or sometimes it does seem like there are those who are in favor of something along those lines, against contraception. On the left, so of course, totally not into any such language of personhood, murder. Sometimes you hear the term clump of cells thrown around to illustrate the opposite view. And of course, the big emphasis is on the woman's right to her body. We can't force a woman to carry something in her body that she doesn't wish to. And of course, to emphasize that there are many situations which people become pregnant against their will. They don't want a child at all, or at least not now. And that's before you get to all the more extreme scenarios of rape, etc., that we mentioned. And the right has different approaches to how they deal with these questions, depending on how far you're going with it. And the left will argue that those who put restrictions, even if they ostensibly carve out exceptions for particular situations, but the whole attitude here is trying to restrict and throw up hurdles and roadblocks. So even in situations where it is justified, or the ectopic pregnancy, or other danger to the mother, or other scenarios like that, will make it very difficult. I haven't evaluated those claims myself. There are those who will also argue that even our community, the Frum, even the Haredi, the black hat community, if in some unfortunate situation someone underage becomes pregnant, or even a regular woman who doesn't have an immediate physical threat but is completely falling apart emotionally, So people will find their way and find the heter and the derech of the tzitz Eliezer. So that essentially means that laws like this would be more stringent against Yiddishkeit. According to Christianity, that's the rhetorical argument you might hear. And that's beyond those who go around saying, well, I personally hold like it's tzitz Eliezer. I don't know what everyone else is talking about. Tzitz Eliezer is right, taking sides. So I hope that sums up the topic we're not talking about. I hope I didn't miss anything important. And I assume that my personal opinion on this question doesn't particularly matter, so we'll skip that. So what I'm more interested in at the moment is what our attitude, what our approach should be towards the question of American legislation, laws in America. Beyond laws that cause an immediate problem, interfere with our lives in an immediate way, but more generally, more broadly, more theoretically. To what extent are we involved? To what extent do we care? Assuming that we're trying to follow Torah and our Makaitis, not to the extent that we care because we just got into it and we think it's great. To what extent does Torah suggest that we should be involved in care? Now, if you think about it, this is really punkt what the Shiur Rambam is about today. We're finishing Rambam. Today is Zayin Chastes. Perek Ches and Perek Tes of Hilchos Malachim is literally touching on these issues. So the end of Perek Ches, the Rambam begins talking about the Ger Teishav. V'chein tziv ha-Moshe Rabbeinu v'pi ha-Gvura, l'akei v'skol boi ha'olam, l'kabel mitzvah shenetztavu b'nei Noach. So there's this idea, we have this agenda, we're trying to bend the whole world to observe the Shem mitzvahs b'nei Noach. And then in Perek Tes, the Rambam goes and enumerates in some detail, and among other things on halacha Daled, the Rambam writes, Ben Noach sheharag nefesh, afilu ubar b'm'ei imay, narag alav. As we say, klar averter. Pretty clear? And if you go through the parak, you see that how there's the death penalty for essentially everything in that parak. So how is that supposed to influence this discussion? When we come to discuss what the American law ought to be. Now you'd think that the discussion would start with the Rebbe. Because who greater than the Rebbe who made a campaign out of Shem Mitzvahs B'nei Noach? So surely you'd expect that the Rebbe would have an opinion on relevant laws in the United States that are relevant to the fulfillment, to observing Shem Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. No? But as far as I know, as of now, and I'm aware that there might always be more information out there that I am not aware of yet. I welcome any ha'aris. But as far as I know, anyone I've asked so far, total silence from the Rebbe on this front. We know that Rebbe did acknowledge certain questions of legislation, generally in the context of positive activities of Chabad, so public menorah, prayer, or at least a moment of silence in schools, etc. We know that Rebbe addressed prison, our perspective on imprisonment, incarceration, and a few other points like that. But on these big, seemingly fundamental questions, these very important laws, these central laws that affect how the whole country is being governed, and seemingly could affect whether we're more in line with Shem Mitzvahs B'nei Noach or less, we seemingly don't find anything from the Rebbe on the record, which is a question. Now, when it comes to abortion specifically, for example, which we're touching on or working around, well, we know, of course, there are letters and minus from the Rebbe. Now, before I continue with that thought, those minus of the Rebbe, by the way, take us back to the previous discussion about what's our view on abortion specifically. Because we find letters from the Rebbe, minus from the Rebbe in this context, where the Rebbe wrote to people trying to persuade them about the importance of continuing the pregnancy. And the Rebbe invokes the language of Ritzicha. You don't want to commit murder. I think in one of them, the Rebbe even makes a comparison to the Nazis, if I recall correctly. So can we conclude that the Rebbe is taking a side in that discussion? But then there might be others who might argue that say that it's hard to bring proof from the Rebbe when the context is not halachic per se, the context is persuasion. Maybe when the Rebbe is trying to persuade someone, the Rebbe uses strong, powerful language. And some who wish to argue the opposite, to argue against murder as being the Rebbe's declared shitta, point is a Sikha from Shabbos, Yud Beis Tammuz Tafshin Chav Beis, where the Rebbe Taka asks, why is this the halacha that a Benayach is killed and a Yid is not? It's printed in the Isafis Lekut Sichas Chelik Beis, Yud Beis Tammuz. The context there is that the Rebbe is explaining Yom Huledes, what the importance of a Yom Huledes is being born, including relative to the state that a fetus is in before it's born. So after the whole explanation, the Rebbe concludes there and says, now we understand the reason why Benayach is not a Yid. The difference between an Uber and a Noilad is that an Uber is not its own Metzias, it's a Tafel. Tafel to the mother, or a Tafel to the Metzias that will come soon. An Uber is not there yet. So since it's all a Tafel, and the whole creation is on behalf of Yisrael, so Ben Noach is among the Tfeilim, so gets killed for a davar tafel also. But the Yid, his Metzias is the Iker, so it can't be that we would end the Yid's life on behalf of an Uber. The Uber is a tafel, the Yid is an Iker. You can't eliminate an Iker on behalf of a tafel. Hashem and Benayach, presumably they're both tafel to the Iker Habriya. It's still Aser, because the Uber is the necessary preparation, the necessary step before you reach a Noilad, and you already have it behelim, but mis is only for something inyan shebegili. This is just a tafel. It doesn't exactly sound like a ringing endorsement for personhood. Okay, you can argue contrarily that the context here isn't halachic either. It's not negei lamaisa, at least in the minus the Rebbe was talking lamaisa. Although the Rebbe does present it as explaining the two dinim. But with the information we have now, it looks like you can argue this endlessly. There isn't any way to fully conclude one way or the other. Anyway, again, that's not what we're actually here to discuss. The question isn't what the Rebbe wrote to this one or to that one, but did the Rebbe have an opinion, have a stance on the question of the law? As we said, the Supreme Court decision was from 1973. It's a period in which the Rebbe was certainly willing to address current events in his talks, and do we find anything at the time? Does the Rebbe acknowledge these events in any way? So I had this question. I went to look, and I actually did find from this period some kind of almost mysterious mention. It looks like it might be connected or not, or maybe not. So Vayakel Amid Gimel, Shabbos Vayakel Amid Gimel, which comes out to March 73, which is about 2 months after the big decision. The Mov Sikh about Mir Yehudi. So we find in the record of what the Rebbe said, the Rebbe says that lately there's a discussion about returning Shtachim, portions of the land of Eretz Yisrael, because there are millions of Arabs there, and what are we going to do with them? Right? Presumably immediately after the Yom Kippur War, Sinai or whatever. At the same time, so there's a population problem. What are we going to do with this huge population? At the same time, the agenda is to get Jewish women to have no more than 1 or 2 children. And then comes the following line. The Rebbe says, "Was benegeya chayk hapala is doch abgeret. This is doch a demokratia." We'll get to what that could possibly mean in a second. But why do you have to send social workers or whatever to Sephardi young women to persuade them to suffice with 1 child with 2 children? Now, the context is clearly Eretz Yisrael. My problem is that, as far as I can tell, there was no discussion about a chok hapala in Eretz Yisrael at the time. And generally it seems that aside for strict medical reasons, abortion was pretty much banned in Eretz Yisrael, at least legally, at least formally, till 77, 78. Doesn't mean that they enforced it. And in fact, it could be on the contrary, but at least we're talking about a chok, the law, it seems like it was forbidden, illegal. And then in 77, 78, then they really opened up the allowances. Possibly it was the influence of the United States. I've heard people say that laws spread throughout the world in the wake of the decision here. But even then, even as of 77, 78, it wasn't a complete unrestricted right. There still had to be a certain reason, a certain basis. From then you start hearing the opposition of the frum people, Haredim, as we'll get to soon. But I can't seem to find anything in Tafshin Lamed Gimel 73 about any hot button topic relating to Chok HaPalah in Israel at the time. Maybe someone will come along and will be able to explain it. It's possible. In fact, I found on the Knesset website that this law from 77, 78, so a law, for a bill to become a law, there's a process. It can often take months or years. So they have it all enumerated there. It started in 77, it advanced slowly in 75, 76, step by step, until 77. It's possible that if the bill was already submitted in 74, so it would make sense that discussions surrounding it probably had begun earlier, but still sounds like the Rebbe is referring to an existing law. So is this somehow some kind of derech agav, some kind of casual reference to the hot topic in the United States? And what does this statement even mean? Is this being said sincerely, or is this the Rebbe just being sharp and sarcastic? And even if it's sarcastic, can there be any sincerity in sarcasm? Well, anyway, it's interesting that there's this phrase, whatever it might mean, 2 months after this decision. Now, if we're mentioning the law in Eretz Yisrael, we actually find that the Rebbe did address and did acknowledge this issue from Tafshin Lamed Vav and onwards. Now, really earlier, in Tafshin Chavtes, we find a letter from the Rebbe to Shazar, where the Rebbe references a woman, Shenihala Ta'amula Neged Magefas Hahapalas V'chulu, and the Rebbe is referring to Mrs. Geula Cohen, and in a letter that he had just written to her previously, the Rebbe writes, Shehelsa Hanida and Deribui Hayeluda B'Artseinu Akdesha U'B'chol Tfutzas Yisrael. That sounds more like a pro-birth agenda, less anti-abortion per se, and it also doesn't seem related to the law, just as a social question. But in Vayikra Tafshin Lamed Vav, which, like I said, as far as I can tell, it was in the process of being passed, we find a lengthy discussion about this law in Milah V'Sicha Mir Yehudi. The Rebbe says, "Danach is doch Punkt wie man sagt, Mitzvah gereres Mitzvah, al derech zeh as euch lehapech." Can't say the opposite, lehapech, as das bringt an Inyan Bilti Ratzui. So starts with Mir Yehudi and then leads to the next thing. The Rebbe says, "Was das is as letztens is dorten geworden a choik as me meg machen hapolis melachutziyos." And in parentheses in the Shema, abortions, in case you wanted to know where it says that word in Sichos Kodesh. Man dorten mefeisem gewen, as in die letzte Jahr is gewen 50.000 oder 60.000 fallen von hapalot melachutiyot. The Rebbe says this is something that even the Gruim Shabbat don't have it on that scale. 50,000. And the Rebbe says it can't be. It's not a secret, because if we're working on that scale, you need to have places. You have to have batei cholim. The lashon here is have to be clinics where you can do this, and it can't be a secret, because 50,000 in a population of 3 million at the time is not something you can keep a secret. And that's the number that we know about, the Rebbe says. Who knows about what we don't know about? And they, whoever the Rebbe is criticizing, they're not meicha. If you hear something like this, how can you stay seated there in the government, presumably? The only ones making a tumult are the doctors, and they're putting their livelihood on the line by doing this, and they're tumbling. And later the Rebbe continues and says, this inyan is doch a gefährliche Zach. Befrat that you have a Rebbe, and the growth by Yidden is 10% legabe by the Araber Rahman al-Islam. And that's because by Yidden Machmen Hapolis, Ein kann Amokel Adabe Begnussim Shal Yisrael. Rabbi says, versteht doch jeder was wird dort sein in a paar Jahre rum, you can imagine what will be in a few years. And there's more on it there, you can check it out. I didn't have time to check every small detail, but seemingly this is criticism against the Mafdal, the religious Zionist party that was part of the coalition then under Rabin. But from the Rebbe it sounds like there was no other macha, at least not from the Mafdal, and we know the Rebbe is more likely to say something when no one else is, and particularly here where the Rebbe is sort of adducing and adding it to his broader attack about Miyu Yehudi. But as time went on, especially after it was passed, it's not fully, the timeline isn't fully clear to me, especially with the Lashon of the Sikha, but based on when we see now that it was passed, we see that as time went on, there were protests from at least the Charedim in Eretz Yisrael. In 1977, also Agudas Yisrael entered the coalition, the new coalition under Begin. So they were involved now. And there was a lot of discussion about fixing the law. And the way I understand it is that originally one of the categories that permitted abortion was for social reasons. You can make the case that right now socially it doesn't work out, whatever the standard was exactly. And that was the particular object of ire from a people. Unlike other parts, it says, for example, under 17 and over 40, automatically sounds like no questions asked. So that doesn't exactly seem to match halacha either, although maybe we can learn something from the fact that the Fruma focused more on the social question and not the other ones. But over time, it seems like it was fixed, it was changed with the Charedim's intervention, and it was removed. It's not clear to me exactly when. We'll see soon that the Rebbe was still talking about it at the end of the Mems, but you'll see how the Rebbe refers to it though. So during this period, from this period on, we see the Rebbe acknowledging these activities in various ways. So really, right in Tav Shalom at Zion, there's a letter from the Rebbe to a Rav where the Rebbe says, I don't know what else I can do. In addition to what I've already done, not all of it is known, and in addition to the Gedolei Yisrael that have already released their Kol Kaidas. But in Tav Shalom Ches, the Rebbe writes to a Rav, it's printed in the Safas Lekut Tzir's Chelik Chaf. I presume it was included this year in Igros Kodesh Chelik Lamed Gimel. Didn't have a chance to check. The Rebbe says, L'chayre achas me'apa'ulas asher gam al pi derech hateva yi'ilos b'shatach ha'amr. You want a tactic that's effective? He shenashei Yisrael adoris be'eretz Yisrael yafginu b'dibur u'b'ksav u'va'asifais pumbius. Women, Jewish women in Eretz Yisrael should protest in speech and in writing and in public gatherings, which is a surprising thing to see, based on other things that Rebbe said about women in protests. Rebbe says, Kivin she'ikar atayna shebegolei shel hatzad l'um hazeh, harei hi zchuyot ha'isha be'eretz ha'kodesh. The whole argument is women's rights, and we need the women to be the face of this campaign publicly. And the Rebbe concludes the letter, Hashem Yisbarach yatzlichai b'avodaseh b'kodesh lahamid hados al tila b'frat b'choy kanegeya u'pegeya b'yuluda shel revavis miYisrael. So this is the Rebbe consulting, giving consultation ideas to people involved in this arena. We find additional mentions here and there throughout the Mems, but particularly in the Sikh of Chayisarim Mem Tes, just a few days after the very nasty elections of Mem Ches Mem Tes 1988, in which Dagel HaTorah split off, and the whole election essentially revolved around Chabad. And we know how much the Rebbe got involved then, in an unusual way in the political campaign, in the election campaign. But a few days later, Shabbos, the Rebbe delivered a talk on Achdus. Let's move on, let's try to reconcile. And as the centerpiece, the Rebbe mentions fixing this law. The Rebbe says, so much of the argument has to do with putting the government together, but there are some things you don't even have to wait for the coalition for, right? Because in Israel, after the election, then you have weeks or months of trying to put the coalition together. The question would be, would both parties be in the coalition or not, and would they have different conditions, etc.? But there are some things you don't even need to wait for. because it's already been taken care of. And there might even be a law in the books, and it's just not being enforced properly. So that could be, the Rebbe says, that could be a perfect theme for a mutually beneficial reconciliation that can bring everyone together. It's already a law, everyone's already on board. So now we could just figure out how to execute, how to carry it out, how to enforce it, to find, maybe to appoint someone to make it his cause. So for example, the Rebbe says 2 religious related laws. One is chok she'oser hapalot, except, and then it says in parentheses, except in special cases of danger with a special medical approval. So interesting that the Rebbe is acknowledging that somewhat. And a law that prohibits netuche mesim, which was a big issue for Haredim for many years in Eretz Yisrael, the autopsies without the family's permission. The Rebbe says these laws were already passed, but they're not being enforced properly, they're not being kept for whatever reason. So we can have a double benefit, we can fix the problem, and it can be a method for negotiation, for reconciliation, for bringing the 2 parties together. The Rebbe says, why did I choose these? Because I'm an Agav. I want people to Yidden to follow Shulchan Aruch. But if you don't want that, you can pick something financial. Why am I mentioning all of this? So here we see, that if the Rebbe wants to, the Rebbe is certainly able to join these types of discussions regarding laws, even if Lav Davke, this is the top issue on the Rebbe's agenda. So in comparison to that, back to the American law, silence. Of course, there's the fundamental difference that in Eretz Yisrael, it's like basically one large Jewish community. So obviously the Rebbe wants to influence the observance of Torah mitzvahs in every Jewish community everywhere in every aspect. But the question is, what is our attitude when you have a non-Jewish country where Jews are a tiny minority and most of the Jews are already not observant? Sometimes you could say, like I mentioned before, that the Rebbe tended to focus on topics that no one else is addressing. Like it sounded like in Tav Shalom Vav with abortion then at the time. The Rebbe says, they're not talking about it. So therefore, Netuche Mesim, the autopsies, the whole Firma Welt was storming for a long time. But even though surely the Rebbe cared about it just as well, but the Rebbe never seemed to join the tumult. And the simple reason, seemingly, is others are already on it. So we don't need to join, we don't need to get on board with that. That's its own discussion, its own question as to how the Rebbe did or didn't work in concert with other from leaders. But at any rate, even if it's not a top issue, but usually you see references here and there. And particularly in this instance, it's not as if the Fruma community in the United States had a declared view on this topic as to whether we should be involved, whether we should have a say, whether we should try to influence one way or the other. Right? The very, very from their shita usually is, we don't care about what everyone else is doing. Adrabah, the worse they are, the better. And we just feel better about ourselves, right? So it would be interesting to look, I didn't do this in particular, to see were there any other major Rabbanim or Jewish organizations that had something to say during this period. Can't check every single detail. Maybe others know. Maybe they'll let me know. But anyway, if the Rebbe, Dafka the Rebbe has a special shita in Shav Mitzvah B'nai Noach, so if no one else in the Frum community necessarily knows one way or the other, you would expect that the Rebbe should have something to say. Maybe we'll still find something, but as of now, I asked, I looked, I haven't found. To ask this question another way, now we'll talk a little, we'll get a little bit into politics, but ultimately I want to get to the Torah Dika part, to the Mekayros. Looks like it's going to be in part 2. But since the end of the 70s, there's this general idea, this general concept that this nation is divided. You have conservatives versus liberals, progressives, right versus left, which more or less corresponds to Republicans versus Democrats. Until the 70s, it wasn't necessarily so straightforward, so cut and dried. And even subsequently, it took a long time till everyone got on board with viewing it through this lens. At this point today, it's almost impossible to look at it any other way. But it started, you could say, dates back to around then. And in fact, you already start seeing certain voices in the Frum Olam making this argument, even though traditionally Jews leaned more Democrat. In particular, we find this with Rabbi Victor Miller. Victor Miller was an American boy. He was, you could say, Neskayev to Yiddishkeit through Lubavitcher Chassid in Baltimore, but Avram Elia Axelrod, sat with him, learned Gemara with him, gave him a time in learning, and ultimately down the road he actually traveled back to Europe, went to the yeshivas in Lita. After a few more stops in his life, he ended up as a Rav in Flatbush. Okay, maybe at the final step, I think it was Flatbush. And he was like, you could say, a local Flatbush Gadol, somewhere in that realm. Very influential on the yeshivish olam here in Brooklyn. He's famous for some of his books, and particularly for his shiurim, because he used to do open questions and answers. He'd answer any question in the world, and no matter how interesting. And he didn't hesitate to speak about politics. Until today, he passed away in 2001, but till today he has big fans, and they're actually, I think as every day passes, they're typing up more and more of this material from these tapes and putting it online. You can find a lot of interesting material to say it, to understate it, you know. I have an uncle who's a Chashuv Talmud Chacham, but he also writes on other topics. So he wrote an article during the last elections where he was writing his memories of the elections of 1980, Carter against Reagan. And he describes how the Frum organizations, Aguda, etc., so they stood with Carter. But the streets, Ocean Parkway, they were with Rabbi Victor Miller, they were with the Jewish press, they were all arguing that you can't vote for the left, you have to vote for the right. He describes it at length. So, in my view, that's around when you start seeing this trend of hatred to the left and love or support for the right. What's interesting to point out in passing is that Dafka, right then, the Rebbe had a special Sikha, Yud Shvat, between the elections and the inauguration, where the Rebbe says it's not fair what's being done to the outgoing president just because he lost. Just because he lost, that means that you can say whatever you want about him. You have to have a karas hatoyv for the good things that he did, which is very interesting in that context. At any rate, if you search online, you'll find all kinds of colorful quotes from Victor Miller on these topics. Would play well on the radio, you know, it would, in theory. And the sense is today that about 90%, if not more, of the Frum vote is pretty much on that page. That's where everyone pretty much is. And again, so seemingly total silence from the Rebbe on this front, even though this was an issue that was already developing at the time. And again, seemingly, in the name of Shem Mitzvah B'nai Noach, we have a strong argument to make that the left is trying to undermine religion, religious practices, religious values. The right is standing up and fighting for it. So, in addition to what we think about particular individual laws, should we ignore which party seems to be on board with promoting our values and which is against? And again, it seems like total silence from the Rebbe, at least that's my impression. And even after you subtract, well, clearly Chabad doesn't really want to be perceived as political, as partisan, although today not everyone seems to even think so anymore, or maybe they think today it's important to look partisan. But seemingly the Rebbe could have found the opportunity to at least express generally which direction we lean in. And as far as we know, still nothing. So I want to suggest a certain general direction. Can't take achrayas to attribute it directly to the Rebbe. First of all, because you need to go through 100 pieces of information, or hundreds, to get to a proper maskana, or even a half proper maskana. And also because so much of what we're talking about is just the absence of the Rebbe being silent. It's hard to build a shitta from that. And b'chlal, nothing I'm saying is etched in stone. It's a discussion, opening a discussion. Right, so, okay, we're going to have to pause soon, but that's the plan. So let's say you have a Frum Yid. Frum Yid buys in fully to the right, the political right. And he's very upset about the old law, pro-murder, very excited about the old decision. He's excited about the upcoming decision. Is this an expression of being frum, being loyal to Torah, or is this an external influence from following politics? Because if we're just concerned about the Torah, take a look there in the Rambam, the same halacha, Perek Tas halacha Daled, v'cheinem harag reidev sheyachal atzile be'echad me'ivarav nerag alav. You kill a reidev instead of just maiming him. Nerag, that's ritzicha. So according to Yiddishkeit, stam a reidev, you're not allowed to shoot to kill without other input, information, data. Except for above machteres. Even above machteres, it depends very much on the context. You have to gauge if this is truly a case of above machteres. But dafka in the more right-leaning states, you find laws like the castle doctrine about protecting one's property. You can be proactive in protecting your property, which according to some versions of it, to my understanding, it's possible you're allowed to shoot to kill, even if you don't have any grounds for assuming that the guy is mamish, b'vchinas above machteres, is here to kill you. And beyond that, you have stand your ground laws, which means that any street fight, any run-in with someone, if you feel threatened, so the way it's described is, you have a license to kill, you can shoot first, ask questions later, and claim self-defense. Those who are opposed to these types of laws call them shoot-first laws. Just a few months ago, a study came out. You don't have to believe every study, but they estimate that due to these types of laws, there are 700 more homicides, killings, a year. Okay, you don't have to believe everything, but that's the argument. So here we're literally talking about executing someone in broad daylight, not just talking about fetuses. And whoever lives in these states essentially has the right to carry out these executions. I'm not sure if I'm the first one to make this point, or I've heard others make this point before. So when the politics are reversed, do we feel the same excitement, the same passion? Just one more example, and we'll pause. What about also in the same halacha? V'cheinem harag treifa. This is, depending on which variation of this, might be political or not. So you have pulling the plug, that corresponds to the traditional political divide, right and left. But what about organ donation? Right? The Frum Oilam says that in order to donate, the person needs to be brain dead with a heart beating. And most Frum people hold that that's ritzicha. Can't start taking organs out of someone whose heart is beating even if they're brain dead. And that's why not signing, they're not checking the box, they're not participating. What about everyone else who's doing it? Isn't it ritzicha? Harag treifa. Are you allowed to even accept an organ in this type of situation if it's a result of ritzicha? Seemingly more of an apolitical, a non-political question. Does this also evoke the same excitement? Okay, we're going to have to pause here, but Mir Hashem, either tomorrow or the next occasion, we will be mamshich. Hashem.